Welcome, everyone. We are lighting the candle, a world that works. And I'm Bill Carell. Uh, I have been for most of my life, probably not in the womb, but shortly thereafter. And quite frankly, it's an interesting state because it's one that changes frequently. The me that I think I know doesn't seem to have a lot of durability over a long period of time. And I'm talking, 10, 15, 20, 30 years as things change. One of the things that I'm sitting here noticing today, being in the company of my two good friends, Jan Jeremias and Ken Caputo, is that when we speak to each other, and now we go back, I don't know if either of you have listened to one of the early podcasts, but I think that would be a hoot to go back and just look at the conversations we were up to about 3 years ago when we started all of this. So I think what I'm rambling about is many reminders coming up. It's been amazing to me how August has been uh, reminders of when my older daughter and son-in-law got married on the reservation and all the wonderful things that went along with that. And, the getting indoctrinated into tribal customs with regard to weddings. And also that's the most number of Native Americans I've ever been in a space with in my entire life. There's about 102 of those folks. And then there were my family members. So there were four of us that we would say are not Native Americans. It was marvelous. And we began many wonderful relationships there. Of course, daughter number two and her husband, it's their wedding anniversary in August also. So then there's the passing of two of my family members, my younger sister, Laura, who her 50th anniversary of passing was about 4 days ago. So for me, it's kind of been an interesting month, just kind of noticing ups and downs, and then getting an invite to reunite with old neighborhood cronies, and we haven't seen each other in pretty close to 50 years. So it's just a real out of the usual quiet month for me for everything except for reminders from old family get-togethers and family passings and that sort of thing. Does that make any sense? So I don't know about you, but when I get a Facebook memory and there's something that's written on it, either by me or by somebody else that's coming up, I immediately get a flashback of when it first happened. I get a flashback of the occasion itself, then a flashback of the, commemorating it with a Facebook post, and then maybe a follow-up, a little bit of laughter or something like that with a family member. And then I go back to, no, that's not now, that was then. And in some cases, it's a little bit melancholy. In other cases, it's kind of rejuvenating and rejoiceful, where it brings a little shot of energy in the moment. So I'm wondering, those reactions to things that have happened in the past. We've talked about triggers and all that sort of thing before, and the relationship with that happening and then the reaction to the triggers. But I'm wondering also if there isn't a conversation that we could have about lifelong increases in both capacity and also capability. So when we start out, there are a lot of things that we know we don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to become a longer list the older you get. The ones that you're aware of that you don't know. And there's a kind of a healthy place to stand in the middle of, you don't know what you don't know. And so therefore it can be freeing. So in terms of evaluating the holistic view of capacities and capabilities, they're good ways to measure organizations. I haven't heard them talked about too many times in non-specific conversations. Like, for instance, if you're on a science track, in education, you can track your capabilities and capacities very, very simply. Or even if it's an exercise program or some type of a competitive athletics program. But for the rest of us that are not engaged in those kinds of long-term developmental sort of things, where it might be more along the lines of just having experiences for the sake of seeing what happens, what's available for us and for those people? And how does that look?
Two books come to mind It's just one called Thinking Fast and Slow. Um, and the other one's No Self, No Problem, which, they're both kind of like neuroscience-y.
Yeah.
But one of the core premises behind them is we're wrong most of the time. We come to completely erroneous assumptions. It's not our fault. I mean, one of these books they're even talking about like uh, patients of epilepsy who've had the two halves of their brain separated, so like they can't communicate anymore. And when they're when they're speaking from just their left brain, they'll make completely false statements with an absolute conviction they're true. Makes perfect sense to them, and they have no awareness because they're only using half their brain of that fact. So it it's left me thinking about the ability, how do you operate from there successfully and embrace that, and have the ability to be comfortable with changing your mind in an instant because your premise is what I'm thinking is most likely wrong or at least incomplete, you know so because it's all through this sense of self that's mostly illusory. So I find it interesting, and in a way I think if you think through a lens of if people were to choose to think through a lens of their choices and perspectives being based on a foundation of values that they refine and evolve over the course of their life, they'll have less fear of being wrong, or they'll have less of their identity tied up in being right, you know? And what would that look like? So they're interesting books, though.
The other thing to what you said, Ken, is they also would probably feel better about what they did. I mean, if they came to, we were just talking about if you come from that place of it's probably more joyful than coming from a very closed place, I would assume. But one of the things, as far as that delving into that kind of part of yourself, maybe where you're okay with being wrong or just trying to identify things based much more on feeling as opposed to cognitively. So, the two things I spent and I gave a workshop yesterday that I talked about is one thing that was created by a practice created by Georgia Hurd called heart mapping. If you've
Mhm.
ever heard of that,
Yep.
to kind of, and then the other thing was about mind mapping and basically mind mapping and basically the difference, the heart, what's in our heart is one thing, it's based on feelings and everything, and how the brain identifies things visually and by color. Like that is how the brain works. And just going with those two aspects to kind of, I don't know, navigate your world. What would it look like?
Mhm.
And if I went based on, you know, basically everybody is going to do a heart map, and based on one of the things they identify in their heart map, they're going to then do a mind map or a passion map based on that. So, but it was just like this interesting perspective of looking at something from a different point of view than your cognitive or brain would look at it.
What I think is really interesting in what both of you are saying, what I'm hearing it from you is the whole notion of having um, a way to take a look at something from the outside when it's a physical impossibility for us to see ourselves and our own behaviors. All we can ever notice is the reaction of the universe around us. So, for example, it's like how Tiger Woods learned how to swing a golf club. He had his father follow him around and tell him what he was doing because he couldn't see the swing of his golf club. And so, at a very early age, he to kind of play off of what you were saying, Jan, the notion of either, like I think you said, either being willing to be wrong, or not needing to be right, or there's another way to look at it, which is the inability to detect how perfectly addicted you are to being right. Okay. Especially when it comes to kitty cats, in the middle of podcasts. I mean, there's just no way that you can have a serious conversation, which is just a reminder there isn't anything significant about what we're saying. However, if it opens up a new question for you, in the books that Ken is talking about, these metaphors and paradigms, that's a very beautiful kitty cat. Please do that again.
Yeah, I know he is. He's sports.
Dharma.
Oh
Yes,
yeah.
she's a sweetie.
Yep.
So beautiful.
Yeah, I'm getting cat envy for the moment. I don't have any more. We went 40 some years with at least 5 to 7 of them. So
I'm there with Bill.
yeah, so what I'm really getting at here when we were talking before, the whole notion of capabilities and capacities, when you can separate what happens from who you are, like that it happened around me and I notice it, it's the universe is indifferent to that happening. It's an accident. Okay. So that being the case, there's nothing to prove. There's nowhere to get. There's nothing to do. All there is to maybe find the humor in the situation and see if there's something that gives you a new place to stand in the universe for a better question. So, for example, and I want to say this again because I'm not sure if it got out there, but if you recognize that the most important education you ever get in your life is the one where you start to notice how blind you are to your own addiction to being right. You don't have a choice. It's very, very fundamental in the wiring for the fight or flight or all the other models that have been developed. None of those are true, by the way. They're just different ways to language and experience that would be instrumental in allowing people to see something separate from their own identity and from their own experience so that it might be useful to them.
I was just thinking about years ago. I was taught 2 martial arts forms, and they were designed to do kind of in a sequence, but for 2 different environments. So these are like Chinese kung fu forms, and one was designed for kind of an open, flat ground, kind of agricultural environment, and the other one was you're on a boat. So one of them taught you to have this kind of very broad open, changing position and perspective, but you've got a solid ground, like your base is solid, you can trust that the ground won't move. And in the other one, you had to have these very shortened kind of steps because you were on ground that was unstable. And it just kind of strikes me that if you train to be on solid ground, and then someone says, all right, fight from the boat, now your skill set doesn't help you. Not really. It's requiring something different. So in that moment of realization, you've practiced to be this way. You've developed all of these skills and these habits and these perspectives. Who are you going to be when that no longer works? And I think that's kind of a question that I'm pondering a lot. And it's something I watch in people, because right now the world we now live in, from my perspective anyway, isn't one of solid ground. We're all on the boat, and the boat is very, very rocky. So either you learn a skill set that allows you to live in very uncertain and unstable times, or what do you do with the fact that your skill set may not match well to the environment we now find ourselves in?
Ken, what you're describing, it reminds me of something I do with my yoga students all the time. Because basically, I mean, yes, there are people who do, yoga on paddle boards, kind of thing. But basically, you're on
Yeah.
solid ground. And one of the things that I do is I actually have my students stand on rolled up blankets and stuff, because it teaches proprioception and sort of like adjusting to uneven surfaces. And it happens to be that when you can do that and you get back on solid ground, you balance better. You have more, you're more steadfast. But when you were describing
Right.
this kind of idea, is basically that once you learn something, you can't, like, once your body is trained on that, like, when you do that style where you're trained on the ground, you basically take that with you no matter what. So you always
Mhm.
keep that skill set. And it may be buried somewhere beneath you, and maybe you have to recall it, but you have that skill set. And so that when you go into other circumstances, no matter what you do, it's not like you can take it out, it's there. And hopefully it will add to whoever you are in a different circumstance in some way. Maybe not obviously,
Mhm.
but you're using it in some form within yourself, and you navigate the world with that, maybe not at the forefront, but definitely as being a part of you.
That would be a healthy way to handle it, but you may have someone else who's like, stop the boat or let me
Right.
off the boat, or it's not fair that I'm on the boat,
Oh, no, no,
or
absolutely.
who manipulated me into being on the boat. This doesn't match who I remember when I wasn't on the boat, and those were the best times of my life, like all of those kind of conversations. So,
Yeah.
and it's
No,
just interesting when you're talking to people, yeah, like, do they look with curiosity as how to translate or evolve, you know, the portion of the skill set that does, and let go of things that don't work, knowing that maybe they'll end up back on solid ground and then they'll be even more skillful, but it's interesting. Like, you can't control the boat, but you control who you are, you know,
right. And I
who you
agree.
choose to be.
And I agree with you because you will get people, and you get people all the time who are like, I don't really want to be on this boat.
Mhm.
The funny part of that is that's almost everyone. Okay.
Yeah.
There are, and then there's the whole range, the whole rainbow of the ones who I can't let you know that I don't want to be on this boat, or I have to make this look like it's really working and fun. Otherwise, I can't stand being around here. But what I hear that I think is really powerful is everything that you become unconsciously competent with, that becomes a habit, it's now a new point of stuckness in the universe. Okay. It's now the new normal. And what the normal does is it challenges your ability, and it stands in the way of your growth sometimes, especially if you are attached to what it took you to get that new habit. And you're still in that stage where you're noticing that you've got this recently generated habit. And again, it turns into Nietzsche's hammer and nail, right? He who is good with a hammer thinks everything's a nail. Sometimes your new habit becomes that, and it also gets in the way of maybe the inquiry you were in while you were generating the skills within the habit. So I keep coming back to a very interesting thing about human beings is that you have to interact with someone else in order to notice something about yourself. And you ever notice that there's kind of like a fall line where these habits are really good and I'm very proud of those habits, and then these over here, well, I haven't put much time into them anyway, so I know I suck at it and it's not a big deal, or it's really causing me some pain in the world. All of the habits that got formed are ones that either replaced habits you've forgotten that you had, and once they have been replaced, they disappear and you don't even remember. But it also is an opportunity to choose a menu for going forward. What's the cafeteria going to offer me in terms of growth potential and new capabilities and things that I can do, and decide that I'm going to place myself into these situations to be challenged, so I'm going to grow. See, here's the neat thing about what we're talking about. Our thrownness is to go back and refer to something in language that we already have, like how I do this with my yoga students, or what I've noticed, in martial arts, or all of that sort of thing. And then there's another level, that's out beyond all of that, where you can ask a question of somebody else, and it will generate the new paradigm to have the conversation in, which isn't necessarily a reflection of the expertise that you have granted yourself knowledge of. When you're really sure that you're good at something, like the meme on Facebook that says, "What's a subject that you could talk about for a half hour without stopping?" So people can make choices about that. But the neat part of it is, do you know they don't notice all the ones that they could talk about for a half hour, but they're not thinking about? And where does that list normally come from? And so while life is going on, are you creating an opportunity to go through life having the ability to see something that is totally out of habit? Whether it's good or bad doesn't make any difference, but is it unthinking and unmindful? That's really where I'm coming from. And how do you get the opportunity of determining a strategy for being mindful. Ken, as you said before, where you actually can notice and you can listen and you can hear as you get older and you get less interested in how good it felt to be right when you were right in the past. And now it's not about that. Now it's about choosing to be uncomfortable in your not knowing how to shift it from whatever it is to now being competent. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, and just to add to that, just an interesting complication. So in talking to teachers over the years, they'll be an expert in what it is they teach, and their students can be very uncomfortable if the teacher says, I don't know, or I was wrong, or that's a better way, I changed my mind, because the position that they're in is one where other people have trusted that they will have the answers for them, and there's kind of pressure exerted to do that, so it can actually be hard for them. So now they either have to help the student navigate that discomfort, risk a loss of authority is what some would voice,
Yeah.
which leaves them in a position of now making up answers that aren't necessarily true. And the other thing that can be very interesting is how it's easy for people to misconstrue expertise in one element of life as then having expertise in other elements. So if you're an incredibly successful business mogul, that doesn't mean that you understand relationships. Yeah. But people will just see success and then make assumptions, and then inadvertently put you in a position of feeling like you need to have some kind of expertise, that you may not have. So there's also that part of resolving that discomfort of, this expectation that people can have of us that may be misplaced, and how do you handle that in a balanced way?
I'm waiting for your response, Jan, because your mind has been churning over there, and I'm wondering where you're getting to.
No, I mean, I was just thinking of other areas that I've experienced that. I've experienced a lot in the health field where, I mean, I think that people look at, let's say, doctors with a certain amount of authority and knowledge, and they don't want to admit that they don't know. So they tend to compartmentalize you into a diagnosis, for example, which maybe doesn't fit you, but they make it fit. Or you have, and some of it is like that because you might have, like some of the what they might label as the symptoms that go along with an illness or something, but not everything. But some of it is this inability, I think, to admit that they don't know. So that's what I was in my mind because I've spent so much time in that realm.
Well,
Or they get attacked for not knowing.
Yes,
They
they
get
get,
blamed for not knowing,
or they get
So
sued,
because
for not knowing. And
yeah,
I
I'm
think that
scared. You don't have to have the answer for me. I'm scared. There's something wrong. You need to fix it. You're the expert. That's
well, to go to that knowledge and maybe even to what you said, Ken, is then people having to own or take responsibility on their end.
yeah.
So, is the other side of that, no matter what, is if you go to a teacher, is just being responsible for your own education and learning on your own, whether you have so maybe, just taking your responsibility if you're in health, if you're interested in your own health, taking responsibility for that. So you're not totally reliant on the knowledge of someone else.
So there are some people that would, dead on 1000% agree with you, Jan. The greatest single human breakthrough is when you recognize it is your choice to take responsibility, whether you do it or not. I mean, that's a different deal. But the very first thing that has to be put in place in order for people's lives to function is that for them to at least realize that there isn't someone else out there who's pulling strings, and there is no one with you while it's either working or not working. And when they finally get that and they start experiencing a little bit of desire to get some muscle in that area, like in all areas of their lives, where up to a certain age, and in some cases, I mean, it's going to be very, very different depending on what kind of home life someone has had till the time that they go through puberty and into adulthood. But the main thing is that there are people who live their entire lives and never are confronted with the choice or the notion of it is my choice to be responsible or not. And then if you choose responsibility, guess what? I mean, it's a really bad idea, okay? Because you're now open to all of the things that didn't upset you before because it was somebody else's deal. Someone else has got that handled, all right? It's not up to me. It ain't working, and I hate that, but it ain't up to me. So the neat part of all of this is that's the first thing is, and there's a new kind of a renaissance in terms of the first thing to take responsibility is make your bed, clean your room, pick something and make sure that it is something that you will from now on build upon, maybe a little bit in new areas each day. But the military the military view of it from the commencement speech that I heard was make your bed, and then Jordan Peterson says clean your room. Okay, and at least you'll have something that you did, that you accomplished physically in the world. You noticed it before, during, and after. For me, it's mow your lawn. I mean, that's one of the few things in life that I can actually start and finish within an hour and a half and be able to sit back and enjoy it afterwards by having either a lemonade or a beer or something. Almost everything else, I've made more progress today towards being in the middle, not necessarily close at all to the end, but it's a neat thing. So in terms of having capacities and capabilities, as opposed to something being wrong, how about a question like what's missing? What's missing and what would it make possible if it were taken care of? Kind of a different place to stand from. That didn't feel good. I hate how the thing turned out, and it's somebody else's fault. But what sort of awareness would you want to invite yourself to be able to ask a question like, so that didn't work. Now what's missing? You hear the responsibility in that? That once you've identified what's missing, you can give that a shot. You've got some action that you can take. There's a question there that can lead you to more questions, as opposed to a decision that it just didn't work and it never will, and I'm done, and I'm going to park my butt right here for the rest of my life. Thank you.
I always like the question, who do I choose to be in difficult times?
Yeah.
Because it's that, like you're talking about, there's that, that responsibility part, because you don't get to choose the difficult time, may not be fair, it or whatever, but what you do get to choose is who you're going to be,
I was talking about this yesterday in my workshop regarding something, and I was saying that there was a time in my life where I went through something where I have to admit that I don't think I handled it with grace and ease. It was a really, really traumatic experience, and I crumbled, and I always looked at that as being some sort of I think I was very critical of myself for that. And then realizing, first of all, looking at myself with forgiveness and compassion was key. And realizing that at that point, I did a lot of second guessing, like I should have seen it, should have known it was going to happen, kind of thing. And then realizing that in the place that I was at that moment, I wasn't able to see it. And looking back, whatever 20 years later, yes, it's obviously much easier for me to look back and say, see it with a broader view. But at that point, I couldn't see it.
Well, there's a neat thing that you're pointing to, although I don't think you're quite saying it yet, and that is that most people do a post-mortem on an outcome. It's like, what happened after all the work was done? Forget the work, just what happened, and you know, and why did it happen, and what's wrong with me, and what's wrong with them, and what's wrong with it, as opposed to, let me see, I kept track of what I did up to here. I didn't get the outcome I was looking for, and I'm certainly not bad and wrong because I paid attention. And I also know that every time you get up to bat, there's three different outcomes. You can hit the ball, you can walk, or you can strike out, or you might get hit by the ball. There's a fourth option. But one of those three things is going to usually happen. And the same thing happens when you enter a poker tournament. 350 people enter the poker tournament. They all know that only three are going to take cash home. And then they all try to second guess the outcome. See, if I had played this hand differently. No, there is none of that. It's what are you going to do the next time you get put into that situation? Are you going to ask yourself, are there options here that I can take before I act? Or are you going to habitually try to do the thing that you didn't do well the last time, exactly the same way as you did it last time and the time before and the time before that, hoping maybe it'll change. Maybe I'll get this, it'll work this time. I just wasn't, I wasn't sincere enough the last time. My sincerity this time will get me through it. I'm pretty sure of that.
Tony Hsieh talks about poker in his book Delivering Happiness. He passed away, but the CEO of Zappos, and he applied it to business, and the principle that he learned from it was the ones that are the most successful don't try to win every hand. They play a longer game, and they're willing to take the losses when they come and stay focused and not double down on a dumb idea. So it was just really interesting, just made me think of it as soon as you said poker, because it's there's some lessons in the games that we play, I think, if we're paying attention, that can add a lot of value to the way we play the game. Not the winning or losing of the game, but the way we play. And
that's it. That's the whole thing. It's not the outcome of the win or the loss. It's the having multiple options as opposed to binary options, to either go all in or fold. Well, maybe I could do a small raise here, and in business, it's a perfect fit in terms of a metaphor, because if you ever read Super System by Doyle Brunson, he says, I've lived my whole life and not gotten shot on a half dozen occasions because I always felt it was better to win a small pot than lose a big one. And that's how he was continuously able to come back and do it again. And I think business people operate that way too. It's better to have small gains than to do big, great things that consistently fail. And I think that most people who are looking for, I call them breakthrough junkies. It's like you get to that point in your business and you finally get a sale. And now you think it was because of something that you said. So the next 25, interviews with people are re-saying everything that you thought you said that worked in the first one, where you got a yes. And then you finally decide it's got nothing to do with you. It's got an awful lot more to do with the people on the other side of the table. And that maybe what you didn't notice that you did the first time was you listened at the right time. You didn't realize it. You didn't see it. You didn't know it. But the key thing was the yes came from, there was a space to say yes into. No script. And so the whole notion of listening for openings and listening for the opportunity for other people to take the lead and give the next step to happen, as opposed to a prescription that you seem to think is pretty workable for you. It's worked in the past. We'll try it again here. And in group dynamics, Ken, I'm sure you can talk about this for days, but in group dynamics, the authority model isn't necessarily the one that gives you the greatest organizational growth. It might give certain people comfort and other people discomfort, but where you replace the authority model for the empowerment model, and now it's not a question of is there leadership in the room? The question is whose voice will it take in the next sentence?
Yeah, it's interesting when I'm working with organizations, what they consider team building, like all of the models that I kind of introduce and teach on are really based on opening up pathways to understanding of themselves and each other. That's it. And then when you watch them literally strengthen their, as that understanding comes, there's these connections that occur because they're seeing each other differently, and they're seeing not only how they're different but how those differences can actually be complementary. And it gives them a clearer paradigm of how to work together. And then all of a sudden they have breakthroughs, leveraging opportunities, solving problems. But you just focus on helping them look through, not here's a prescription or a solution, here's a framework for us to experiment with as we think, about the way we view the way we do this, or the way we approach whatever it is. So you just give them frameworks. And half the time, what's really interesting is then they'll take that framework and they'll immediately start to change it to fit what their organization needs or their culture or the way they think. So you just give them a start point and then they just go, and then my job is to get the heck out of the way. So, but it's interesting how less stressful it is. And I've had people come up to me afterwards almost in tears about just having had years of being told they had to do it a certain way, or they had to work harder, this like kind of try harder, and it was just the thing that always loops through my head is just, people can come in and say, if you were more like me, you'd be okay. So instead of helping them figure out who they are and what okay means to them, they're superimposing, I'm successful, I've done this and that. And if you want to be successful too in your company or whatever, just do what I did. And sometimes that can be true, but other times it isn't, so it's very interesting.
When you follow that roadmap, Ken, that roadmap is really good for you to know whether or not you're in the ditch or on the road. But more often than not, where you end up is not the same place with the person who wrote the map. More times than not, something has changed. The road doesn't go to the same place that it used to. There's things that are in the way, the bridge is out or something of that nature. And the really cool part of it is that a roadmap should give you confidence that somebody's done this before. And after that, now get ready for what happens. Now get ready for what life's really going to bring you, because that's where the fun is. Not sitting and crying because the map told you there was going to be a bridge here, but now there isn't. Okay, now what? What's the next thing? And, I adopted a teaching style early on because I noticed after I'd been so-called running my company for 2 or 3 years, there are only 5 of us. I mean, what's it take to run 5 people? I mean, there's no such thing. And I actually went away for a weekend, and I came home with a little different of an attitude. When people came to me and asked me questions after that, whether it was clients, vendors, or associates, instead of answering their question with what I thought the right answer was, I would ask them, what do you think? And they'd say, well, I don't know. And I said, well, okay, now what? And they said, well, why don't you tell me? And I'll say, well, I wouldn't tell you if I could. Now what do we do? And then later on, this is something that I adopted when I was in manufacturing. It just came down to the code words, handle it, which basically said, it's okay for you to fail at this. Now go give it your best shot and see what happens. And come back and be ready to talk about it and say what worked and didn't work. But the whole notion of looking to the authority figure for the answer, which gives you no muscle, it gives you no struggle, it gives you no opportunity to actually internalize and take something in as a habit, which is what the succeeding and failing is all about. To hear somebody say out loud in front of another group of people, I wouldn't give you the answer if I had it. This is your question. You don't need my answer.
Help them figure out how to find better questions.
we didn't have that sentence as much as we would now, having, a lot more time in grade, because you got to remember, I was only like 26, 27 years old. I barely knew how to, put my button down shirt and my tie on. But, in retrospect, in terms of raising children, the whole notion of putting a series of questions in front of them as opposed to telling them what to do, I finally got the message, when they were early teens and maybe 11 or 12 years old. And they came and they asked permission to do stuff. And my answer was, up until that point was either yes or no, right? But at some point I started saying, no, let's see what your decision making looks like. What are the merits of this? What are you going to get out of being able to do this thing that you're asking to do? And I want you to know that I'm preparing you. There's going to come times, when you're in high school and you're doing things, and I won't be there to make your decision for you. You're going to have to count on yourself, to look around, see what's going on, and make your choice. Now, they never thanked me for doing that. Not one time ever did they say, well, thanks, Dad, for not giving me the answer and training me how to make my own decisions. No, I think it actually pissed them off, to be honest with you. It was easier when you didn't make me stand here and explain what I'm doing, what I'm doing. But they both graduated from high school. They graduated without experimenting beyond, the point of maybe experimenting with a whole lot of different things. And they made it into their 20s successfully, where a lot of their peers and classmates didn't. And there's nothing for me to take any pride or ownership in that at all, because that was their accomplishment. They were the ones who made the series of decisions, this place, that place, and other places, to either do or not do. And now that they're in their 40s, it's a different conversation entirely. The last time either one of them called me and asked for advice, it's usually with something really big, like, what are my first steps to getting in a position to get a mortgage? It's not about what should I do. It's more like, where do I get the starting door for the process? And that feels pretty good when it works.
A little exercise in compassion that's interesting. Decision making is one of the most brain intensive and depleting activities we can do. They do all these studies on how glucosamine gets depleted. And it's why, like, when you travel, you get so much more tired, because you have to figure all these things out, like where you're going, even which direction the shower knob turns. There's like all these things that your brain is put on autopilot when you're in familiar situations. You've got to put effort into figuring those things out, so every time you give someone, so like saying, hey, let's go out to eat here, it's much easier than to agree to that than if you say, should we eat here or there? For a lot of people, unless they have a pattern of making that choice and they have a reference base for it, that's going to be tiring. So by nature, we don't want to make decisions, because it's work, so it's interesting. I remember seeing it with little 5-year-olds, I holding up 2 pads, a blue one and a red one. And I noticed they're going through this line and they're getting a whack of pad. And whatever color I said first, that was the one they would hit 95% of the time. But then I had them come through the line again and I just said, choose, and they'd freeze. Like they literally stopped. They couldn't do it because they didn't get a signal from me that they could interpret to help them make that choice. Yeah. So especially when you're working with, if you have children, don't forget to give them a little space for the fact that you're asking for them to apply. It's not just the difficulty of decision making. It's an investment in energy. And especially if they've spent their day trying to behave, like they've been sitting behind a desk for 6.5 hours in school, trying to do what they're done. They don't have enough willpower left neurochemically to do those things. So you got to give them space to recharge, give them some food, let them take a nap, let them, veg out, whatever it is they need to do to kind of, replete that, or you're just going to wear them out.
Don't we have a opportunity to completely change that model? Take a 5-year-old and make them sit in a fixed position for 4 or 5 hours. That's cruel and unusual punishment. And what would be a
Yeah.
different learning model where they could maybe be in a Quester's Way type of a situation with different stations of things that they could encounter and get some mastery at and feel good about themselves many times during the course of the day.
Yeah, no, it's funny. That's how we developed momentum learning. Part of it was we redesigned our entire teaching model around the idea of give them the information that requires the most brain power early on before they start to fatigue, chunk the class in a way that gives them the opportunity to kind of re-energize, and then let it be more experiential as you get further in. And so the less mind necessary, put that towards the end of the class when they have less mind capacity available to them. And I mean, we watched them, the kids learned, and adults too, they all just learned faster and they retained more. And all we were doing was just saying, I've been doing it the same way for 20 years. And there was one of those moments of, this is wrong. And I remember talking to other, especially martial arts teachers, who had all kinds of pushback. They were so offended because this is the way we've always done it. This is the tradition. This is the way I learned this way. My teacher learned this. Who do you think you are? So I was just like, I don't know. I'm the one that wants to see the students learn better. And I think this might help. So we experimented and found the best way for the time being.
But there
You
is
know?
great value, and and I'm not saying when you would know more as to when to do this, but in actually confusing the brain
Oh,
and
yeah.
having it do different things than it normally does. Um, there's great value in the whole research and study of neuroplasticity and the brain retaining its malleable or moldable, energy or
Yeah.
abilities, and doing simple things to kind of switch up normal daily things, which requires more brain power, more brain focus, and how that keeps you in that sort of that place where your brain has the ability to learn pretty well as you age. So,
You're exactly right. We call that the block 3. So it's like, so experiential learning. The idea is that's where you test things to see how well stick or don't. And it's interesting. Like, one of the things we've learned, especially when it's something new, it's figuring out for them, and especially if they're working with other people, where's the place where learning occurs. And that's when the sympathetic nervous system has to be in charge. If you give them too much anxiety or becomes too challenging, they're not learning, they're reacting. So you push them into where their sympathetic nervous system starts to fire, have some discoveries, and then back them down again so that they can get some feedback, slow it down, figuring it out, and then dial it up again and see if there's a new edge. So it's like these kind of growth reps. But yeah, I mean, we just try to get the part where it's my teacher used to always say, it's not hard, it's new. So if it's new, we want to introduce that earlier while they're fresh, but then get them interacting with it. And that's where you get that malleability and those challenges that you're talking about. And it seems to work better than just go, 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 go. And then, all right, we're almost at the end of the class. Let me teach you something. It's like, it doesn't, they don't do well with it.
I work a lot more in older adults. So I know that Ken has experienced Ageless Grace, which is a mind body movement class. And so one of the big things that we do in these classes is doing things with the opposite side of the body. So normal things, and literally like confusing the brain, almost like your brain feels confused, and then you kind of release that tension by doing things that are almost very physical and very releasing to kind of rebalance, and then you go back and you add in another one. So you might do something as simple as tell everybody they have to like write their name in the air, um, and then write their name backwards or spell a word backwards, which is really challenging no matter what age. And everybody tends to go to their dominant hand of like, okay, I'm going to write my name with my dominant hand because that's natural. And what happens when you make people do it with their opposite hand? So all of a sudden they're using their non-dominant side, and how much concentration and focus and energy requires. And then you also add in that whole element of laughter because no one can do it, like everybody kind of laughs and looks silly. And then you do something which is totally physical, which is kind of just cleansing. The brain doesn't really have to think, you're just moving. You get into that kind of real space where the brain gets to relax. And then you do another one that's very similar. That's a lot of brain work.
It's a really cool program. Yeah, that was a very fun. The way they structured it is really, it's awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, I go in now, I'm back to teaching 2 to 3 classes a week around the state. So, but it's fun. The other day, this woman said, "You really love what you do, don't you?" Because I was having the best time. I was like, it's good music. Usually I get to choose the music. So hope it's good music.
So we're going, I think, really in a really great direction with regard to the original topic. And in terms of applying it to children and to adults, I mean, I've seen it more with adults because I've worked with adults more than kids. But when you're talking, Ken, about any tradition or any type of education system, they're all set up linear. They're all set up to accomplish this, then accomplish that, then accomplish this, then accomplish that, then accomplish this, then accomplish that. And if you were working with one student at a time, that may or may not have, a good outcome generally for a larger group of people. But if you're dealing with 15, 18, 20, or 30 people at a time, where they all have to learn this and then learn that, and then learn this and then learn that, it's not anywhere near as successful, which is when we start dividing people up according into this. It's not actually a scientific phenomenon. The whole intelligence quotient thing is an explanation for why not everyone responds to the same teaching in the same way. So if we were ever to take a situation and say we're going to use the outcomes with the kids' grades and who's being left behind as a judgment of the method that's being used as opposed to the teacher using the method, we might have changed a lot of things that we do as opposed to changing the core things that we teach, but we still teach them in a linear fashion. And what I've seen happen in a couple of school systems was where they didn't have a concept of a gifted or anything of that nature. They just had 4 teachers and assistants in a room full of 15 kids, with all of them working with the kids towards what's next for them individually. And what they found was they got there at different rates of speed, and no one had to continue learning on top of a fundamental that they didn't master before they went to the next step. And that lack of frustration and the aha moment where they actually all succeed at different times, and there's no responsibility for everyone to finish on an exam at the same date, get a good grade, a bad grade. But no, when you've mastered the concepts, then you get a grade. So it's nonlinear. Even the level that you're training kids at, if you stop and you think about it, once you've taught a kid to read, why wouldn't you let him be exposed to Shakespeare or Tolstoy? Why not let his brain get challenged by the words and do what you and I did, which was we read and then we didn't know a word and we went and looked it up. So we had some context for that. We don't use that language skill in mathematics. We don't use that language skill in music. We don't use that language skill pretty much everywhere. But you know who the geniuses turn out to be? Those kids that get exposed to something. And by the age of 8, they're doing dissertations on quantum physics. Is it because their intellect is that much greater than everybody else, or they just happen to have one capacity to learn at an accelerated rate in a particular area that's been identified and then fed that? I've had a lot of fun watching, child prodigies in music, the whole Mozart deal. This was a really amazing human being that really had a life that sucked. It wasn't cool being Mozart. It was one of the hardest things that anybody who's ever left that body of work, that kind of a body of work around, it was almost like being Pete Townsend. Pete Townsend hasn't been a happy boy most of his life either, and tormented. So my thesis is this. We keep doing it over and over and over again with new generations of kids. Some of them fall out and become cast off on the side of the way. Some of them become excellent. Others have fantastic breaks in one area of their life or another. And what if the goal was not to teach kids the same curriculum, but it was to find out at a very early age what's interesting to them and what are they already going to excel at? But then not treat them like a group that only can do that. How about that becomes like the tip of the spear in terms of the learning profile, and all of the other things can kind of get backfilled in at a level where they're taking the importance. Would that be more costly? Would we have more social cost at the end of 12 years of school? Might be 8 years for some, it might be 14 or 15 for others.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have, I mean, for learning to occur, there's got to be some variables that need to be flexible. And, and the challenge with that is when you're thinking in terms of scale and creating a consistent and predictable model at scale, and also making sure that there's accountability mechanisms in there, because humans are humans, and the people that you're become the custodians of that process are going to have varying degrees of skill and also their own biases. So, so you'd see it in martial arts. It's, I mean, if someone says, I don't care how well you can move your body in a form, if you can't take a full blown punch in the face, you're not worthy, so, so it doesn't matter what your curriculum is now. They have a personal assumption that they're going to weave into the learning process for everyone that comes through. Some people will resonate that with some people. So you have to account for that and make sure that those flags pop up in a way where, you can make sure that you're creating, a consistent environment. But, the other thing is, this is always the question with education. Why are they going through 12 years of schooling? What is the actual outcome? And that, I think that you would find that there is very little agreement on what the outcome is. So again, that becomes a significant challenge to scale. If you decentralize it, what type of humans do you get coming out the end of that pipeline, and how equipped will they be to become part of a larger community that shares different skills and belief systems from them? Have you actually prepared them for that? And is that partially what we're experiencing now with polarization? People are very clear on what their beliefs, values, and the things they learned. But that can be very different, if you're in the Midwest versus a urban city. It's just different, I mean, different experiences, different ways of moving through the world, all that kind of stuff. So it's very complex.
And clearly, just because you're in one of those two different places doesn't mean they're homogenous in those places. No, there's a bell curve everywhere, no matter where you go.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So let's stay with the martial arts for just a minute. Martial arts, in my opinion, is more like a one-room schoolhouse in the thing that works, that no matter when you sign up, there's no pressure on you to perform or get to any level of belt any faster than you're able to get there,
That is untrue. I will stop you right there. It's no. Let me explain.
I haven't made my point yet, so please listen.
Okay, all right.
To do that before you refute what I haven't said.
No. There's just some information you're missing, but go ahead.
Well, in my experience, when I did martial arts, I did Taekwondo for about 3.5 years in my early 20s with a guy named Carl Scottinello. And his method of teaching was we would do forms together and all the rest of that, and we'd be taught, and he would model the forms, but then the red belts and the lower belts would also do that as well. So as time went on, if 3 of us came into the class at the same time, there was no pressure for any of us to make a belt within 90 days or 30 days. We made it when we made it. And the fact that we all made it at different times was not a big deal, because some people would get to brown, faster than other people would get there. And then some people would get to red faster than other people would get to brown. So what I was trying to say to you before was the method, it wasn't linear. The learning is linear. Like Tolstoy will always be Tolstoy through every generation. Your ability to understand it, your ability to articulately, feed back on it, and then your ability to turn around and teach it to somebody else comes as a result of a period of time. Like, for instance, when you become a black belt, does that mean you're not necessarily going to go start your own dojo? That's really not what you're selling, is it?
No.
Okay. So in terms of how that represents an opportunity to be different than a regular public school system, which was where I was going. Now, I'm more than happy to hear about how there are time limits that are placed on students that come in.
Yeah, no, they've moved towards the industrial public school model where the curriculum is on a rotating curriculum. So basically, what is taught in each class is that is taught, and you're promoted based on time. So so it's a 0 to 3 year. You get your black belt, and they'll do some remedial work with if you can't keep up. But it doesn't matter how well you've understood something, you're going to get the next chunk of material. So they fixed the time to make it easier for the teacher to teach curriculum, and then it's on the student to retain that curriculum. But you're progressing. It's not even testing. You have graduations. So and a graduation isn't based on skill, it's based on attendance, pretty much. So so even in that world, I agree with you. Like the way we teach is, some students it takes 3 years, some it takes 10. It's so there's a progression, but a lot of flexibility in time. But there are other schools that have reversed that and make that, they make that for whatever, and they have their reasons. They're looking for a different result, which is make it easier for one person to teach groups. Again, they're trying to solve the scale conundrum, and that was the model they used.
We're completely on the same page. Thank you. And I am aware of teaching schools that do not follow the model that you just talked about. And I don't believe that there's anyone who traditionally, going back 30, 40 years ago, would have ever predicted that you'd have to put this on a on a calendar for people to produce, or they quit. It's one of the two things. But I knew people that that I lost contact with that were still working with Carl 15, 18 years later, who'd never made a black belt. That wasn't what they were there for.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
So anyhow,
I'm sure
I love
40 years ago, they probably couldn't have they wouldn't have been able to predict Karate Kid and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that would have created, I lived through that, a swarm of children. There were never that many children doing martial arts. So you had a different, problem to solve now. How do I effectively teach 25 7-year-olds, at a time, so it's interesting.
So mapping that kind of McDonald's approach onto martial arts, I just have to ask, does that improve anything for anyone other than the business owner?
Oh no, I hate it. Yeah, I mean it's no, and
All
it's so we had to figure out, like with our model, we had to figure out from a business perspective, what do we need to charge to maintain certain ratios so that we can give the students the right progression, and also how do we manage their disappointment when their friend moves into another class without them, just because the time frame of their skill progression is slower or faster than someone else's. So it's a much more complex and challenging, it takes a lot more energy on our part, but our commitment is to the student getting the best experience. We want to leave them better than we found them. So when they, regardless of the belt, when their time is done, whether it's 2 classes or 20 years, we've seen both and everywhere in between, they're better for the experience, and we didn't process them through. But the downside to that is it's more expensive. It's a lot more challenging. It requires a lot more energy and attention and innovation constantly. So it's not a franchise model. It's a very organic model. So, for some people, they either don't have the capacity for that, or their goal is, to have a profitable business first, and then those things are secondary. So no judgment
Well,
here, but it's not for me.
all I'm saying to you is that when you try to take something and proselytize it, you want to turn it from something that's an organic skill endeavor where you get it when you get it, and then once you get it, it's yours from now on, into we're going to show you what to do. If you don't get it, we don't care. There's somebody else that's going to take your spot. I've seen the exact same approach used with business coaching, or teaching people how to become business coaches. I mean, that's probably even more so today, where people go through a process, they get a certificate, and now they go out and they try to work with people, and they have no idea what they're doing. As opposed to,
I think when you try to mass produce anything, it has the potential to be where you're not, training people properly, or they're not getting the full perspective of whatever it is. So I look at yoga teacher trainings where, I've done multiple through the years in different aspects and styles, but my original full-blown training was a full year of weekends and weekdays and whatever. And there are people who fly to Bali, for example, and do a 2-week teacher training and come back and teach. And I just don't think they're getting that all-encompassing knowledge of maybe philosophy, or philosophy, anatomy, postures, breathing, meditation, what all the limbs of yoga entail, versus a very streamlined, maybe they have a great ability to teach the physical aspect, or one aspect, but I don't think they're getting in 2 weeks.
I absolutely love what you're saying. And Ken, here's another model that's more like what I'm talking about for the future, that would be better for more kids over a lifetime, if it were less about how quickly we put them through a process and we're done with them one way or the other. Do you know, in the UK, I had some friends when I was a machinist. In the UK, you go through an apprentice program that's going to take 5 years. It's going to take a maximum of 5 years, could be a minimum of 3, but it's going to take somewhere on average around 5 years. And before you can do anything with any type of machinery, like a lathe, a Bridgeport, or anything to cut metal with, you have to take a file, and then you have to take a piece of metal, a piece of steel, and you have to be able to file that over a period of a length to where it's coplanar and flat enough that you can run a dial indicator across it, and you don't get a fluctuation of more than 5 to 10 thousandths. That's really clear at the beginning to tell somebody this is how you get moved on to being, a mechanic apprentice, to a first step to a first class, or a third class, second class, first class. And when you're done with all of this, you're going to be making full union scale, which might be $50,000, $60,000 a year. But while you're learning how to file, you're going to be paid minimum wage. And so the impetus that went along with that training was you got faster because there was a financial incentive to do so in many cases. And then people would do extraordinary things, like find out what are the techniques that I'm going to know after I've done this for a while, like cheat and go and ask, is there a way to do this quicker than just doing it over and over again until it finally one works? And those are the people that usually ended up being machinists for the rest of their lives. The ones that had a real inquisitive nature to them, like, okay, I get it. I get what the goal is, but I also know that there's probably some smart ways to do this, maybe not so smart. And I have a feeling that type of learning approach with kids, and again, back to the martial arts, when we did things together, we would naturally group up into groups of 3, either we were interested in mastering the same skills, whatever Pyong we were working on. And then it might be that we just want to do push-ups together, like, 100 push-ups 5 times a day, and see if we can get ourselves to the point where we can do some of these forms and have more core strength and are able to, to handle ourselves better. And I don't know why I'm energized by this conversation, but I certainly am. The time I've spent with my grandkids, I think they've woken something up inside of me, and I really, I'm glad we're having the chat. So
it's been what I've been working on for 30 years. It's just, how do you, help people refine their ability to learn, and how do you create, systems that allow people to learn in a way that will be supportive of who they're choosing to be as they move through the various stages of their life, and it's complex. It's it is very complex because it's such a human-based thing, and we're all so different, in so many ways. So finding that, it's the scale thing, like one-on-one, it's one thing, but just thinking it through at scale is just fascinating me, unraveling that knot.
Yeah. So I know we could go on with this line of thinking all day long, but I had to make a choice early on when I started doing consulting, and when I started doing computer type stuff at scale. I realized that I could make desktop units in a large quantity and probably make somewhere around 25% gross profit margin on all of them. And I could sit down and I could do the math, and that would tell me what size business I would have, how many people would be assembling, testing, and all the rest of that sort of thing, installing, training, and what have you. Or I could shift my focus to being the best service provider and having people buy their equipment someplace else, and then take on large organizations and help them through the processes and all the things that we're talking about, the things that they don't know with regard to firewalls and security and, just policies and procedures and what have you. And the numbers looked really awesome to me. And I was pretty sure I couldn't do it when I first decided to take on larger businesses. They're now going to expect more from me. And it's the same kind of a thing for a teacher. As Anthony Robbins went along, he started off and everyone could buy the 30-day, Awaken the Giant Within and all the rest of that sort of thing for $79.95 or whatever it was. And then before you know it, you're going to Fiji with him for a week, and that's $10,000 for the first weekend. So in terms of the scale part of it, I think he found it more rewarding working with rich people than he did with masses of people that could only afford $79.99. Although he's gone back there several times throughout his career, including now. I think he does an awful lot of mass stuff to build the farm. But anyhow, Jan, thank you very much for allowing me to just drone on. I appreciate that. And anything else to say, guys, to kind of wrap this up?
Well, I'm good.
No, this was fun.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you. And I'm going to leave you the same way that I always do, and that is to request that you go out, let somebody in your life know that you're really glad that they're here. Text, phone call, email, knock on their door, whatever it takes, but please let somebody know that your world works because they're here. And in the meantime, we are lighting the candle, a world that works. Thank you very much, and bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Xvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at xvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.